with that introduction, which was a great introduction, and so I'll put in a little plug right now, if I'm allowed to do that. I will be doing another tour to Turkey that is open to the public this coming August. Linda, as you just heard, came with me on a previous tour. It really is incredible. So if you'd like to join us and see Gobekli Tepe and so many other sites, I absolutely welcome you. Okay, so I'm Robert Schoch, and I'm very pleased to be at the first annual Parapod, and I'm going to talk about my work on the Great Sphinx, Gobekli Tepe, our sun, and I call this exploring a 12,000-year-old mystery, as you will see. And I really do appreciate being here. I know Tony Sweet is not here at the moment, but I want to thank him personally for inviting me here. And let me just jump right into it. So I have been working on the Sphinx, and I've been working in Egypt and on ancient civilizations for over 3 decades now. I'm a scientist. My PhD is in geology and geophysics, and I was always interested in ancient civilizations, but I really did not get involved in them seriously as part of my research until I went to Egypt in 1990. And why did I go to Egypt in 1990? Because I had met this man in the late 1980s, John Anthony West. Some of you may have heard of him or know of his work. And he had, absolutely, give him an applause, the late John Anthony West. He became a very close friend, a very close colleague. And I could talk for hours just about John Anthony West and our relationship and all the things we did together. But I want to mention just one thing right now, which is that he had been influenced by the European philosopher, mathematician, esotericist, practicing at the time alchemist, R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch. And Schwaller de Lubitsch had gone specifically to Egypt in the 1930s or so to study the temple that's now known as the Temple of Luxor, and Schwaller actually indicated through his mathematical analysis of it, his deep architectural analysis of it, that it's incredibly more sophisticated, and he suggested that this was just the tip of the proverbial iceberg, that ancient Egypt itself was much more sophisticated than anyone had ever imagined up to that time. And furthermore, that this knowledge went back to a much earlier, much more remote period. And this is a quote from John Anthony West just before I met him. He published this in what was known as the Traveler's Key to Ancient Egypt. So quoting John Anthony West, Schwaller de Lubitsch observed that in his opinion, the dramatically severe erosion on the body of the Great Sphinx could not be the result of wind and sand, as is universally assumed, but was rather the result of water. Geologists agree that in the not-so-distant past, Egypt was subjected to severe flooding. This period is usually held to coincide with the melting of the ice from the last ice age. And West gave it the date, which was correct back in 1985, of circa 15,000 to 10,000 BC. So this was a profound sort of revelation to John Anthony West, this passing remark from Schwaller, and he realized that if this was true, it had really significant history-altering ramifications. But what it would take was, in his opinion, a professional geologist, someone who was trained to look at this. So he was looking for someone and searching for someone that had the training and credentials to explore this further, and through a mutual colleague at Boston University, where I was teaching and I still teach full-time, we met in the late 1980s, and we became, over the years, very close colleagues and close friends, and that's another story, but this is how I got involved in it initially. So I said, yes, I'll come and I'll take a look at the Sphinx. I didn't think he could be correct. I thought that all the Egyptologists must know what they're talking about. But I went and I humored him. So at that time, to set the stage, The general concept of the origins of civilization, the beginnings of civilization, were really set out for all to see, should we say, and popularized by a man named V. Gordon Childe. So he died in 1957, but to this day, in the standard textbooks used in colleges, universities, high schools, etc., and every time I say this, I look it up every year to make sure I'm still correct, he is still mimicked. He is still discussed as if he is the end-all and be-all dogma. And basically his concept was that there were fundamental stages of humanity, that we began as savages, savagery, hunters, gatherers, foragers. Then we slowly elevate, we slowly graduate, if you would, or evolve to barbarism with early cultivation, agriculture. For him, it was very important that agriculture had to be developed, and that allowed people to settle down in little villages. This he called the Neolithic Revolution, or the Agricultural Revolution, he and other people thinking along the same lines. And then finally, from this would evolve true civilization, high culture with monumental architecture, sophisticated technology, literacy, that is writing, written records, and cities. And this stage was first reached about 3500 BCE, according to Childe and his colleagues, and to most people to this day in academia, about 3500 BCE in Mesopotamia, known as the Urban Revolution. And I'm here to tell you that basically this chronology is incorrect, and there are profound implications to it being incorrect. So when I first went to Egypt with John Anthony West in 1990, that was the storyline. 3500 BC or so for the rise of civilization, 2500 BCE or so for the carving of the Great Sphinx. And I went there, I looked at it from a geological perspective, and literally within minutes, I realized that there was something amiss with the chronology of the Sphinx. The Sphinx sits on the Giza Plateau near Cairo, so it's faces east. It's on the eastern edge of the Sahara Desert, on the other side of the Nile from Cairo. It is carved down into the bedrock. If you've never been there, that's important to realize. It's a solid limestone structure that's been heavily repaired since, which is why you see little blocks on it to this day. And it sits largely below ground level, other than the head. Just a few pictures of it, and here's a view from the side, and you can see, actually, this is an important point, I'll come back to it. The head is really much too small for the body. Does everyone see that? And I'll come back to it. It's not the original head. So it was carved down into the bedrock, and then I could see right away that this object carved into the rock is not compatible with 5,000 years of Sahara Desert, which we know it was Sahara Desert for the last 5,000 years or so. If it was carved in 2500 BC, it should only show the type of weathering and erosion that you see in desert conditions, hyper-arid conditions. But what I saw immediately was that the core body of the Sphinx, what I call the core body, not the head, and the walls of the enclosure, because it was carved out of the bedrock, show signs of water erosion, water weathering, precipitation. And something that's very diagnostic for that is both what I call the rounded, rolling features of the walls, and also these vertical fissures, which you do not find elsewhere on the Giza Plateau, even though we're talking about exactly the same limestone layers. So I saw this very quickly. That's younger me and John Anthony West, and you can see how big some of those fissures are. So this is not just minor little rains once in a while, major rains. And I want to point out, it is not due to Nile flooding. Some of my critics sometimes say, oh, it's because the floods of the Nile sometimes reach the Sphinx, which is true. but not up to the top of the Sphinx anyway. And secondly, if it were Nile flooding, you'd get a very different type of erosional features. You get a lot more undercutting of the softer layers, etc. I've looked into that quite in detail. But what it shows is evidence of these protracted rains. Again, younger me there. And you can see how you have these vertical fissures. In some cases, it's like a little tunnel. That is not caused by wind and sand blowing laterally against it, or sand trying to drip down it. What you have with wind and sand erosion, wind erosion, you see just a few hundred meters from the Sphinx exactly the same rock. Everyone can see the difference? I think it's very, very obvious once you start looking at it. This is a wind tunnel effect. But you get some of the walls that are just sand blasted, but they're still smooth. In some cases, you can even read hieroglyphic inscriptions that go back 4,300, 4,500 years. Diagram to show how you get the rain erosion and the wind erosion. And this takes out, in both cases, the softer layers. It's like a layer cake, if you would, the rocks. And it takes out the softer layers, but in a very, very different way. This is wind erosion that I'm looking at. And here you can see the wind erosion in the upper left-hand corner, and the rain and precipitation, the water runoff in the bottom right. Younger me there, a bit older there on site. I've been there so many times I can't remember, but I love it each time. Just a couple of other perspectives, and that is a person down there just to give you a sense of the scale. So my very early analysis indicated that this had to go back to an earlier period before there was desert conditions on the Giza Plateau. It had to go back to at least 5,000 to 7,000 BCE. That was my early estimate for many reasons, some of which I'll get into. I now believe it goes back to about 10,000 BC, which is just before the end of the last ice age. This was enough, though, to rile up my academic colleagues. They wanted to fire me. Fortunately, I'd already been tenured. Literally, etc. It caused a lot of agony for me and a lot of controversy. Give you another little bit of evidence. These are mud brick mastabas, dried mud brick mastabas, not far from the Giza Plateau and the Saqqara Plateau. These are dried mud brick. If these are even touched by a little bit of water, what happens? They just, crumble away. It shows how dry it's been for so long. I also want to point out that the Sphinx, when they carved it down into the bedrock, a lot of people don't realize this if they haven't been there. You could carve the body of the Sphinx just by chipping the rock out with hammers and chisels and pickaxes, and just cart away scraps of rock in baskets. That's not what they did. They carved out multi-ton blocks. Some of these blocks are 50, maybe even 100 tons, and they moved them forward to form structures which are referred to as temples nowadays. Whether they're really temples or not is another matter. But they formed what's known as the Sphinx Temple that you see here, and then another one called the Valley Temple. And not only me, but several other geologists have done analyses of these blocks. It's like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. You can literally figure out where they go back into the enclosure. So they were not doing it the easy way. They were doing it the hard way. And in many senses, I think these structures in front of the Sphinx are even more magnificent, if you think about it from an engineering point, than carving the Sphinx itself. And they're contemporaneous with the body of the Sphinx. So they go back to about 10,000 BC also. Here's some pictures of this. This is the Sphinx Temple, the so-called Sphinx Temple, the so-called Valley Temple. There's a person for scale. You can see how big the blocks are. There's the Sphinx Temple and the Valley Temple to the left. And that's actually John Anthony West when he was still with us, walking by the Valley Temple. Look at the size of these blocks. I mean, it's just incredible. And what's really interesting is that these were limestone, this is limestone, these were limestone structures. They don't need anything more. These are huge, 50, 100-ton blocks. But they were heavily weathered and eroded. And then later, using Aswan granite, which comes from Aswan, they were resurfaced or recased with huge blocks of granite. So this granite has to be younger than this limestone. Does everyone see that? And what do we have in the granite? I know it's quite eroded, it's hard to read now, but there are hieroglyphic inscriptions in the granite that all the Egyptologists agree go back to about 2500 BC. So if that's the case, which the Egyptologists even say it is, the original structures must be incredibly older, much older than 2500 BC, which confirms what I've been saying all along. Other evidence, we have, this is me on the back of the Sphinx, we have evidence of extreme antiquity in the repairs. The Sphinx has been heavily repaired over the years. Sometimes people go there and they see the paws. Well, they don't really see the paws, they see all the repairs on the paws because they've been totally encased in repairs. This is me. These are modern repairs, which I literally have watched them as they make some of these modern repairs. But look at this, these are ancient repairs. And various Egyptologists who have studied this in great detail, so it's not just me saying this, agree that some of these ancient repairs go back to the 4th dynasty, the very time when supposedly the Sphinx was carved initially. How can you be repairing something and repairing 3 feet, a meter or more of repairs, when it was just carved literally yesterday or a century ago? It makes no sense. So again, it suggests, not to me even suggest, but is very strong confirmation that the structure goes back much earlier. So this was all good, and I had all this data, but I'm a geologist, geophysicist. I wasn't going to stick my neck out. I wanted some independent, non-surface data. So what I wanted to do was see what was below the Sphinx, and so we did seismic testing. And what we did was we took a sledgehammer, which we pounded on a steel plate, and this is my colleague Thomas DeBecke, Dr. Thomas DeBecke, who's another geophysicist, and that's John Anthony West at the time. And we pounded on the steel plate that puts energy waves or frequencies, sound waves, you can use any term you want, and puts in the rock, and then reflects and refracts, and it comes back to the surface, and you can model what is under the surface this way. And what this allowed us to do, as we carried it out, and that's Thomas DeBecke and John Anthony West at the time, there I am, we found that there was uneven subsurface weathering, think mineralogical changes, which occur once the rock has been exposed. Once the body of the Sphinx has been carved out, mineralogical changes take place, and they get deeper and deeper with time. Does that make sense to everyone? And so they get deeper with time. So this allowed me to calibrate things. And what was really interesting is that it was very deep on 3 sides of the Sphinx, but much shallower. When I say much shallower, we're still talking a meter or so deep, but much more shallow at the rump. And this was actually not unexpected to me, because looking at the surface features and the surface erosional features, I'd already started to hypothesize that the body of the Sphinx was carved out first, and it had been allowed to be still attached to the bedrock, and that later the rump was carved out in dynastic times, 2500 BC. And that is what the evidence of the subsurface seismic indicated to me, that this portion was carved out later. And you see how you see it? This is an old black and white photograph I took, but it shows it well. This is the weathering that's not compatible with Sahara conditions. That goes down to here. And the rump of the Sphinx had been contiguous here. And so later, I believe, and this is compatible with other analysis we did around known structures that were dated by hieroglyphic inscriptions, etc., to 2500 BC. This shows the level of weathering there, but the rest of the Sphinx shows much deeper subsurface weathering. I could calibrate that. My conclusion at this day in 2023, based on the most realistic calibrations, is that it goes back at least to 10,000 BCE, which is really quite astounding in the bigger picture. Why? Because most academics would say that civilization itself only goes back to 4,000, 3,000 BCE. They couldn't be carving things like the Sphinx or building structures out of huge multi-ton blocks that early. And if you want more details on any of this, it's in my books, Forgotten Civilization or Origins of the Sphinx. Also, very interestingly, and the Old Kingdom, during the Old Kingdom, it was cut out and the rump was essentially released and the tail was repaired. But originally it seemed to be connected to the back wall, the rock wall, and also on the vernal equinox during the age of Leo, the Sphinx looked out at itself, or at least at a lion that would rise on the horizon, and the way it rose was actually the rump would be the last, sort of connecting to the horizon. So one suggestion is that the age of Leo, when is that? That's about 12,000 years ago, which is compatible with my seismic data, my geological analysis, and I wasn't trying to get the age of Leo, it just worked out that way, but that the Sphinx was looking at essentially itself in the sky. And this ties in with work that I've done with my colleague, Robert Bouval, and boy, I'm sorry, the bottom got cut off there. It should say Robert M. Schoch and Robert Bouval, because we actually wrote a book together called Origins of the Sphinx, and you may have heard about his original theory he was developing around a little bit before I got involved with the Sphinx, that the major pyramids on the Giza Plateau correlate with the belt stars of Orion, but the correlation is not perfect in 2500 BC. It's not perfect today. When is it perfect? About 10,000. He dated it to 10,500 BC, which is really close to my dating on totally separate evidence for the Sphinx. So it all seems to start to correlate. Also remember, the head of the Sphinx is what? Too small for the body. I hope you can see that. And I pointed this out to Egyptologists back in the 1990s, and a lot of them said, oh, that's crazy. The Sphinx is the greatest structure, greatest statue that's ever been carved. But when you start looking at it, and they admit it, when they start looking at Sphinxes that are known elsewhere, they have much bigger heads relative to the Great Sphinx. And we postulated, John Anthony West and I, that, yeah, this is not the original head. And I'm convinced 100% it's not the original head. Maybe it was once a Sphinx, but maybe it was once a lion. And that was actually my best guess until a few years ago, that it was a male lion. The head had been eroded down and then recarved into a human head to turn it into a Sphinx. And what we've learned recently, and this is work I did with my colleague Dr. Manu Saifzadeh, and also Robert Bouval was involved in it, is that the Sphinx, it turns out, we're convinced, was the lioness Mehit, or Mehet. And the Sphinx was originally not a Sphinx as we think about, but a female lion. Not a male lion, but a female lion who was guarding an archive, which ties in with my original seismic work, as I'll talk about in a second. And literally, the Egyptologists had often questioned, why wasn't the Sphinx talked about in the early hieroglyphic literature? Why wasn't there any mention of the Sphinx? Well, there are mentions of the Sphinx, but not as a Sphinx, as a lioness. So it solves that. And also I want to point out that part of the solution to that ties in with this statue of this person, Hemi Unu, who was a 4th dynasty official, high official, who lived just before or around the period of supposedly when the Sphinx was carved according to classical Egyptologists. So that's important. He's about 2600 BCE, somewhere in that range. And he held a number of titles. He was a very high official. And one of his titles is shown here in hieroglyphics, and it includes the lioness Mehit. The lioness Mehit. But the lioness Mehit in his title has this weird bent rod sticking out of her back. Why would you have a rod sticking into your back? And what Dr. Manu Safzadeh first realized and hypothesized, and I think he's made a very good case, and we've made a very good case, this bent rod is a key. It represents a physical key. And what Hemiunu had was, as a title, was that he was king, or not king, he was a chief of the scribes, and he held a special key. And when we do a translation of this, we can say that he was the overseers of the scribes of the king. That's what's being referred to here with the inkwell, etc. This is Egyptian hieroglyphics for a scribe. And he was the king's, and he was master of the key to the lioness. So he was the master, this is what this represents, to the key to the lioness. Or, to put it in more poetic terms, he was the king's chief librarian, more or less the scribes of records, and guardian of the royal archives of Mehit. That this represents a key to a lioness who's guarding an archive. And it turns out once you realize that and you think about that, you start looking elsewhere. This is from the so-called First Dynasty. This is about 3000 to 3100 BCE, a good 500 years or more before supposedly when the Sphinx was carved. What does it have? There she is. There's the lioness with, again, the key in her back. Here's another, this may in fact be the lioness too, with what? An archive underneath. Or if you look at the stela, the so-called Tutmosis IV dream stela that sits to this day between the paws of the Sphinx, we have actually 2 sphinxes, and that's another issue totally. Is there a second Sphinx, as well as the Sphinx that we all know? But what is the Sphinx doing? Sitting above what looks like a building? No. I believe now, based on the evidence, that that is an archive, a chamber under the Sphinx that was holding is still to this day, I suspect, holding very ancient records. So we have it all together, putting it together, that the Sphinx was a lioness guarding an archive underneath her. And this is where I find it very personally interesting. Back when we were doing the seismic work, not only were we looking at subsurface weathering, but we could model features under the Sphinx using the seismic data. So this goes back to my work with Thomas DeBecke and John Anthony West in the early 1990s. What you have here, you're looking down on the Sphinx, so a map. Everyone sees the body of the Sphinx and the paws, the left paw and the right paw. And there's the head of the Sphinx would be right there. And what we have here are different, what we call anomalies, seismic anomalies. This is a very hard layer of rock, so don't worry about that now. This is a chamber or a cavity under the left rump. It's probably late period. The Egyptologists already knew about that. This anomaly B looks like a collapsed tunnel to me, geophysically. But what's really important is there is a definite chamber under the left paw. Definite chamber under the left paw. I have no doubt about that. And that chamber could be, in fact, I believe it is, based on the evidence, the archive, the records. And in fact, it's long been talked about how there's a chamber under the paws of the Sphinx that holds some kind of records, and we found, I believe we found it seismically. Some people have heard of him. Edgar Cayce? Yes, Edgar Cayce, who died before I was born. I want to point that out. And I knew who Edgar Cayce was, but I didn't know he had anything to do with chambers or sphinxes or Atlantis, that type of thing. But lo and behold, he, sometimes referred to as the sleeping prophet, decades before I ever thought about the Sphinx, decades before I was born, he actually said that there would be found a chamber, what he called a hall of records from Atlantis, or the Atlanteans, would be found under the paws of the Great Sphinx. He was a little vague. I've had the opportunity to go and see the original archives, and I actually interpret the original archives as saying it's on the right paw, but I believe he was talking about facing the Sphinx, so that would be on the right side, which is actually, in my terminology, the left paw. So there it is. I think it's really interesting. I was really upset when I first learned this in the mid-1990s when one of his sons who was still alive called me. Why was I upset? Because it only created more trouble for me academically. You know, the last thing I needed was people saying I was out there to prove a psychic right. So it's there. I have no question it's there. And I think it contains records from that early period, from the extremely ancient times. So another question that sometimes people will ask, and I just want to address it briefly, this is the stela between the paws of the Sphinx. We know this was erected about 1400 BCE. It shows the Sphinx above what I now interpret as the underground archive or chamber. People say, well, how do you enter it? There must be an entrance to it. Many people say, oh, the entrance is behind this stela. There you see the Sphinx in the chamber. We did some other seismic work, not just around the Sphinx, but we also ran some lines here to see what was under the sand in front of the Sphinx. And this is what we found, which I just find incredibly interesting. Here's the Sphinx. This is a picture from the stela, showing it over what looks like a chamber structure. And what we found in the sand here is that under the sand is a cliff face. So I suspect, this is just my hypothesis, I suspect that the entrance to this chamber is in the cliff face, going in that way, which would be a great way to protect it now that it's all buried with sand, etc. So my original dating of the Sphinx pushed it back to about 5,000 to 7,000 BC. This is just one of my little diagrams from the present, going back in time. This was enough to create a lot of uproar and turmoil for me in the academic community. It made headlines at the time around the world. People say scientists clash on the age of the great Egyptian Sphinx. Scientists say new view of Sphinx could rewrite history, etc. I always thought those were a little overstated. I've become more comfortable with them now. Seriously, the other thing I'll say, and I don't mean as a joke, this is incorrect as far as I'm concerned, because at the time it was not really scientists clashing as far as I was concerned. It was geologists who are scientists, but when I spoke to my fellow geologists, they basically agreed with me. If anything, some of them told me, well, you're not pushing it back far enough in time based on the raw data. And it was Egyptologists who were disagreeing with me. No offense to them, but they have different type of training. They're trained to think a different way. And again, I'm not being offensive, but they're a different field. I was just talking to someone, I won't point anyone out, who remember seeing this when it first came out. The Mystery of the Sphinx, it came out, there's another person, 1993, hosted by Charlton Heston. Why Charlton Heston? Because he had been Moses. Seriously, that's why he was picked. And also he was a great guy and was really interested in it, won an Emmy, that type of thing. But again, the Egyptologists and archaeologists and historians were in uproar. They organized, and the date is important here. I'm not trying to push myself, tell you how old I am, but it's no secret. This was in 1992. They organized a big conference at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, basically to disprove me, which was, in my assessment, unsuccessful. They did not disprove me, although they went away thinking they did maybe. Why? Because people like the Egyptologist Mark Lehner, who also, by the way, went to Yale, got his PhD there, but again in Egyptology. I was geology and geophysics. He said, and this is verbatim, if the Sphinx was built by an earlier culture, where is the evidence of that civilization? Where are the pottery shards? They like broken pottery. Because, no, seriously, and they do. They use it for dating. I'm trained in archaeology too, I understand. People during that age were hunters and gatherers. They didn't build cities. That is, they did not have civilization. They were still, remember Fee Gordon Child? They were still at that stage of development. Now, I do want to point out, because sometimes people will say, well, even today, are there hunter and gatherers around? Yes. Even as we have iPhones and technology, you can have civilization and hunter-gatherer societies existing simultaneously. But what he's saying here is that there was no one above the level of hunter-gatherers. And what I'm telling you is that the evidence shows otherwise. That in 10,000 BCE, not everyone was hunter-gatherers. Yes, there were pockets of hunter-gatherers, just like today, but there were also pockets of advanced people, civilization. So this was sort of a stalemate for several years because I didn't have any other evidence in the Sphinx. It's just like I'm a geologist and paleontologist, among other things. Just like when you find the first dinosaur bone. If you reject it, throw it away, then you find a second one. Well, now it's the first one because you threw away the first one. Am I making sense? Now, you could just keep throwing away data forever and you'll never get anywhere. So I said, no, we have real data, even if it's only one major point so far. But fortunately for me, 1995, so several years later, enters this man who unfortunately has passed away. He was Herr Professor Dr. Klaus Schmidt with the German Archaeological Institute. Here I'm talking to him on site of Gobekli Tepe. And he started excavating Gobekli Tepe in 1995. So 3 years after that debate at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, this was, technically it had been discovered earlier, but people didn't realize how old it was because they hadn't excavated it. But he realized how old it was. This is in southeastern Turkey. It's actually near the traditional home of the biblical patriarch Abram or Abraham, which is in Urfa. And he was talking about building phases going back to 10,000 BC. He said initially 10,000 to 8,000 BCE. And lo and behold, that's what I've been talking about, had been talking about for several years, that the Sphinx goes back to that earlier period also. So Gobekli Tepe is in northern Mesopotamia. Of course, the Sphinx is down here at Giza. And his initial date was even older. This is the initial dates. His initial date for Gobekli Tepe was even older than my initial date for the Sphinx. Now we can push them all back to the end of the last ice age, roughly 10,000 BCE. I also want to point out, for those that are interested, the Gobekli Tepe is in northern Mesopotamia between the Euphrates and Tigris. So that is actually where the Judaic, Muslim, Christian religions, the Abrahamic religions, place Eden, the general Eden area. Garden of Eden would have been within the general Eden area. Just a side note, but maybe there's some significance to that. Gobekli Tepe consists of about 20 or more megalithic stone structures. Only 4 or so have been fully excavated, portions of other ones to this day. The number of them have been found geophysically, which is very close to my heart since I'm a geophysics. geophysicist in part, geologists and geophysicists, so we know it's a huge site. Only a small percentage of it has been excavated so far. This is in 2010 or so. I've been there, Katie, my wife and I have been there a number of times, so I'm going to show you pictures from different times. This is looking south. It's at a higher elevation, looking south over the plain. That is actually Syria in the background. It's on close to the Turkish-Syrian border. And this is a modern picture. When I say modern, 2020, this particular picture, it's now a UNESCO site, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The Turkish government realizes how important it is. The world realizes how important it is. It's really changing history. So they've built a wonderful canopy over it, and they have a walk around it so you can see it well. And it's very safe. It's They take incredible care of it, and they want to protect this because they know how important it is. In some ways, I think they're sort of competing now with Egypt, because Egypt has the monuments and the Sphinx and the pyramids. They have Gobekli Tepe. But to know the real story of civilization, you need to take it both into account. Here I am in 2010, May of 2010. You can see what Gobekli Tepe consists of are these rings of pillars, T-pillars they're called, stone circles. People can think about Stonehenge, but it's not like Stonehenge because the pillars are beautifully carved with carvings on their faces. This is me in January 2020. It was a cold day in January. It gets very cold there in the winter. But here you can see some of the pillars in the background. And this will just give you, I'm going to flip through them just to give you a sense of the site. And this is when we were there in 2020, just before the pandemic broke out. We'll be going back now this August, as I mentioned. Anyone wants to join us. And it's a really incredible, beautiful site. This is an older photograph. This, at one point, they were starting to crate up some of the pillars. Not to move them, just to protect them. But then they've taken the crates off again. You can see how these pillars are beautifully carved. You can see the animals carved in them. Some of them, this is not attached to the pillar. This is carved right into the rock. So this is all one piece, is what I'm saying. One piece of carving, so it had to be planned out. There you see some close-ups of some of the pillars, and this is sometimes referred to as the beast, beautifully carved. It's just incredible, and it's really out of place, out of time for 10,000, just think round numbers, 10,000 BC. Some Egyptologists, some archaeologists I've spoken to off the record have said to me that if they found this in isolation and could not date it otherwise, stylistically, they would put it 600 BC or 1000 BC, not 9,000 years earlier. More carvings is sometimes referred to as a vulture pillar. This one interpretation is that the sun, electrically charged particles, plasma, frequencies, things you've maybe heard about recently at this conference, they all tie in with Gobekli Tepe. That would be another 2 hours for me to talk about that. More of the pillars, just to flip through these quickly, just to give you a sense of what the site looks like. That's actually the original pillar that the landowners found at the time. When I say they found it, it was buried, totally, and they thought they hit a rock they wanted to remove. So they were trying to chip away at the rock, and you can see how they broke it. They didn't mean to do that. And then they realized there's something big underneath there. And that's when it was really acknowledged. Another pillar, they're just really incredible. And some of them are anthropomorphic. So if you look at this, they have arms. This is actually an arm carrying a little animal, like a little dog type animal or fox, under, sort of nestled in the, under the arm. There you see more, just to give you a view of it. And they are set very shallowly in the bedrock. but they're oriented in the bedrock. So they are carved and they were oriented very, very precisely. And you can see that, and I'll come back to that point, because they're not just put in willy-nilly and they can't be moved once they're in. They knew exactly what they were doing and they were orienting them. And they did amazing engineering. So this is the bedrock, and actually they carved the base, these little type of animals on it, which some people think are, animals that are no longer exist, they're extinct, go back to that early period. And then here you can see in part how they would cut a notch to set the pillar into, so they were very precisely aligning them. And Gobekli Tepe is up here, and it's, as I said, the area that some people think of as Eden, and it's near the modern city of Urfa, which also plays a role here, because Urfa is known as the city of prophets. It's the place where Abraham, according to the traditions there, lived as a child and preached and spoke against idols and for the true one God. And this is known as the Pools of Abraham. And what's important here for our story is that during construction projects, they often hit very ancient archaeological layers, down to Gobekli Tepe time, 10,000 or so BC. 12,000-year-old layers, and one that they found very close to the pools here, literally just hundreds of meters, was this statue that's now often known as Urfa Man. This goes back to Gobekli Tepe times. This you can think of as how the Gobekli Tepe people visualize themselves or carve themselves, not as like these crude cavemen type, but very, I think, very sophisticated, very elegant, if you would. And this is Urfa Man in the new museum that has been created for many of these artifacts. He has a room unto himself. You can only gaze at him from a distance now. Back in the old little museum, you could get right up to him. There was a plate of glass, but otherwise, I only show this so you can see how big he is. He's basically life-size or more than life-size. He's an incredible statue. Here's another picture of him when they painted the wall behind him. And getting back to Gobekli Tepe, the site itself, major portions, as I said, go back 10th millennium, early 10th millennium, or even earlier. Again, think 10,000 BCE. Here I'm discussing with Klaus Schmidt on site how he was basing that dating, because that was his dating. And even though I liked the date, I wasn't just going to accept it because it agrees with me. I was very skeptical, like anyone else, as a scientist, and I wanted to know precisely how he was arriving at these dates. So we talked about that. And one thing that's very important is the entire site was covered over intentionally. It was buried by 10,000 years ago, probably earlier, but by 10,000 years ago. At that point, the rains would trickle down. I'm being very colloquial here. It would dissolve certain minerals and reprecipitate them. And what that allows you to do is to precisely date things. And I'm sorry that the bottom of the slides are being cut out, but I'm telling you what it says. And you can very precisely date with radiometric and other dating techniques. You can look at it that way. You can also look at the layers of rock and stratigraphy and how it's been laid down. And when you do all that, you find that yes, it definitely goes back to that period. It's actually a much better situation than I have in Egypt with the Great Sphinx, because this was intentionally buried, so it's relatively pristine for the last 10 to 12,000 years, versus the Great Sphinx was being used and reused for thousands of years, and the head was recarved, etc. Also, we talked about how the pillars you've seen already are ornately carved. They weigh 10 to 15 tons, which may not seem like a huge tonnage compared to some of the structures in Egypt, but to carve out these limestone pillars, very thin, very tall, without them snapping when you erect them, is really difficult. I can tell you that as a geologist. He also believed they're set in very shallowly in the bedrock. He believed, and he had evidence, Carl Schmidt did, that they were using a sort of a type of concrete to attach them to the bedrock. So they weren't just sitting there straight, but they were actually filling it in with concrete, which is incredibly sophisticated for such an early period of time. No one imagined they would be doing something like that. As I said, they're anthropomorphic in some cases, with these long, thin arms and fingers, and there's a belt, you can see it. The fingers, the belt, they had loincloths, sort of a fox pelt loincloth. And I believe that when you start looking at Gobekli Tepe, you have all the distinguishing characteristics by which to identify true civilization. I'm convinced of this. You have monumental stone architecture, which is called for by the archaeologists. That's evident. They say, well, there must be urban life, city life. That's what civilization is based on. And the archaeologists will say, oh, Gobekli Tepe isn't a settlement. It's just they call it sometimes the world's first temple, which I don't like because I think it's well beyond a temple. It's more like a university, a museum, a school of learning, not just a temple. But as I pointed out, we have things like Urfa Man. I believe the city that goes with Gobekli Tepe may well be the modern Urfa, which is ancient Urfa, which may have been a city continuously inhabited for the last 12,000 years. I'm serious about that. So we have the city, I think. It's right before us in plain sight, just not recognized because it's still being lived in to this day. Then finally, did they have writing? Did they have literacy? I believe they did, as I'm going to show you in just a minute. So I contend that all of these go back to Gobekli Tepe times. Again, has monumental stone structures, the city life, that's Urfa, and the writing, the literacy. This is something else that I worked on with my colleague Manu Safzadeh. When you look at the pillars, so this is a close-up of what's known as Pillar 18. This was always interpreted initially by the archaeologists excavating that this is just pretty decoration. It looks like a C, H, backward C in our alphabet. I don't think that's pretty decoration. Manu Safzadeh and I were studying this, looked at it. He is very good at linguistics and different scripts. And what he initially discovered is that this symbol in the so-called Hittite or Luwian, it's also known as Luwian now, language, hieroglyphs from the same general area of the world, the Cappadocia, Turkey, Anatolian region, thousands of years later, this represents God. And in fact, we have now, I think, made the case that this didn't just appear out of nowhere. It goes back to a much earlier period, inheritance, and this is the original version of it. That in fact, this is the word for God on the pillar. That yes, they were writing, they had hieroglyphics. As a side note, this also ties in with plasma physics and what you would see when the sun undergoes solar outbursts and what you would see in the sky, which I'm going to come to later in the talk. So keep that in mind because it starts tying it all together. And you've heard about frequencies in plasma. I think something that Katie, my wife, and I talk about is that maybe plasma, electrically charged particles, and electromagnetic fields are sort of the web of the universe and of all of life. And that, I think, starts getting reflected in some of the things that we're seeing at Gobekli Tepe, which I'm working on in more detail right now. This, I believe, this is a expanded view of this portion of the belt, and I think this actually says, my interpretation personally, God of gods. That this is actually reading God of gods, like this is maybe representing a major god or a head god. But either way, when we start looking at it, here is another version, God, and this H-type symbol, I believe, and with Dr. Safesadeh, we've developed this. This actually means gate or portal or door, so maybe door to the gods. You might interpret it as that this is a gateway to the gods. But either way, I'm convinced that the evidence right now indicates that they did have writing. They did have some kind of symbolic notation. We only have a few carvings and stones. I'm hoping that if we get into the archive under the Sphinx or find other archives, we may find other materials that will reconfirm this, corroborate this. But that's the hypothesis right now. So Gobekli Tepe has so much more to it that there's all these different signs of sophistication. Another one is the outline, the arrangements of it. So this is a map view looking down that was published by Peters and Schmidt in this paper on Gobekli Tepe, and I want to use it for just a brief second. This is an aerial view of Gobekli Tepe. You can see some of the stone enclosures, the stone circles, and when you start looking at these are those central pillars I was mentioning, which are very precisely aligned, and there's no question about that because they were cutting right into the bedrock to align them, to give the alignments. And what I've drawn in here are the alignments of those central pillars, which is the alignments of the entire enclosures, and notice they all are more or less southerly direction, and these pillars are anthropomorphic. You can see which way they're facing. They're facing towards the south, but slightly east. And you can see how they get more and more slightly east. Well, why? And this ties in with precession, slow movements in the stars. And I'm convinced that on the vernal equinox, they were looking out toward the Pleiades, Taurus, and Orion, including Orion's belt, or most prominently Orion's belt. And what they were realizing, and what they had to take into account, is that the position of these constellations, these stars, changes over time, very slowly, almost imperceptibly within a lifetime. If you live 70 years, and we're taking observations for 70 years, maybe, possibly, you could get the 1 degree that they move or so. But no, they were keeping records, they were observing, and they had to build new structures to realign them. And the alignments tie in with spanning the last ice age. So this is incredibly sophisticated, also shows the level of knowledge, because most archaeologists and archaeoastronomers up until now, and this is the work I first pioneered on this, up until now suggested that no one knew about precession until the ancient Greeks, maybe 2,200 years ago, or maybe the Neo-Babylonians, maybe 2,600 or 2,700 years ago, not 12,000 years ago. Yet they seem to be taking into account. This is just diagrammatically what they're looking at in the sky: Orion, Taurus, Pleiades, and diagram of what they're looking out over at. And here you have Orion rising on the vernal equinox, and they would see the belt stars of Orion, which are very prominent asterism in the sky. Once you know it, you see it. And there's Taurus with Pleiades. And notice Orion is a headless hunter. Well, think about the pillars with the arms and the belt. They've got a prominent belt, Orion's belt. They've got the arms, but they don't have real heads. They just have this T shape. They could carve a head if they wanted to. We see that on Urfaman. But I think even the pillars are representations of Orion. There's a pillar. Notice this is the, quote, head. Well, it doesn't look like a head, but it is sort of nodding down. And I think that's done very purposefully, very sophisticated. Not that it's primitive, it's that sophisticated. And here is a little companion. Well, what goes with Orion, the dog star? If you follow the belt stars down, you've got Sirius, the dog star. So were they paying attention to that? That Orion is traveling with his companion dog. Do some of these concepts go back to the end of the last ice age? I think they do, and I think we're finding this around the world, that our culture and civilization today is shaped by things that go back to what for many people were unimaginably early periods. So we have evidence, I'm convinced, of civilization at the end of the last ice age. We have physical remains. And in fact, the ancient Egyptians, 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, said as much. They said there was time of Zep-Tepi, that there was a time of Zep-Tepi, which for them, Zep-Tepi means the first time or the time of the creation, the beginning of civilization, a golden age, and they traced their own lineage back to that time, thousands of years earlier than 5,000 years ago in our terms. So they were talking about this, but the Egyptologists would always dismiss it and say, oh yeah, they didn't know what they were talking about. Even though it was them that they were talking about, their own ancestors. We have certainly with people like Plato, the concept of Atlantis and the world ages. And Atlantis, interestingly, according to Plato, was decimated about 9600 BCE. If you put Plato's dating into our calendar years, that's incredibly close to the time of Gobekli Tepe and the end of the last ice age at 9700 BCE based on modern geological dating techniques. And then everyone's probably heard the Hindu Yuga cycle with different golden age and devolution, de-evolution from that period, how we've declined into the Kali Yuga. Are we in the Kali Yuga now? Some people would ask. Even though we're incredibly sophisticated electronically and technologically, does that mean we're sophisticated in other ways? Maybe not. So what could wipe out such an advanced civilization? I'm saying to you now that Gobekli Tepe and the Great Sphinx, among other evidence, which we don't have time to go into now, goes back to the end of the last ice age, shows that there was what I call a cycle of civilization that was incredibly sophisticated, 10,000 BC, and how far back earlier it goes, we just don't know. But it was devastated and basically wiped out, destroyed, decimated at 9700 BC. And we have dating from Gobekli Tepe that's very accurate at 9700 BC, because at 9700 BC we have radiocarbon from plasters and whatnot, which indicates that's the time when pillars like this got knocked down. This was broken. I say knocked down. Notice how this pillar is hastily re-erected on a pile of rubble. That's what they did. This is not something that archaeologists did later. It was re-erected on a pile of rubble. These rough walls were put in place between the pillars to basically hold them together. There's all kinds of evidence that about 9700 BC, there was a catastrophe at Gobekli Tepe. It was intentionally put hastily back into position. Some of the pillars that had fallen over, these rough-hewn walls were built to support and protect it. Look how it's right against one of the beautiful carvings. They didn't beautifully carve that to just put rough walls against it later. This one I think is very significant. It just shows it nicely. Look how this fell down, and they took slabs of pillars to sort of put the top back into position, and then they intentionally covered the whole thing over. They packed it over, what I sometimes refer to as packed for posterity. There you can see it again. And they packed the whole thing over, intentionally buried it. And Carl Schmidt talked about this before he passed away and wondered, why would you intentionally bury the whole thing? As a side note, I want to point out that Katie, my wife, Catherine Ulysses, on our last trip to Egypt, and this is something I'm going to be exploring more now, she noticed that we'd been thinking about Gobekli Tepe and spent a lot of time at Gobekli Tepe, how it was intentionally buried. Well, it looks like there's evidence that throughout Egypt, the sites were actually intentionally buried too. Many of them were packed with mud brick, apparently. Here is Edfu, and you can see they had all these mud brick walls and packing around it. Were they doing the same thing to maybe protect some of the sites from different catastrophes, or from that catastrophe at the end of the last ice age even? Here I think it's very interesting, Colombo, another site we visit when I take people to Egypt, and you know, so many people, they're so focused on the temples and the structures, which are actually magnificent, but sometimes there's clues in the background, like this packing material that Katie pointed out, and now she's got me on another project. She really keeps me on my toes with her observations. But I just say that as a side note, because what's been found in Turkey too is that other sites, what's sometimes known as sister sites to Gobekli Tepe, that are now being found, there's clear evidence these were all packed and covered intentionally after some kind of catastrophe. So we see that right at Gobekli Tepe. So why would they do this? Klaus Schmidt said himself that the Gobekli Tepe was intentionally buried. Some people have argued against this recently. If you saw that on the internet, it's not true. I've looked at the evidence very clearly. As a geologist, geophysicist, no, they are packed intentionally. It was covered over intentionally. And Klaus Schmidt suggested, which I would agree with, they spend as much energy and time burying it as they did building it initially. Now, it's a different type of energy, packing it in versus carving it. But this takes us back to the last ice age, the end of the last ice age. And 10,900 BC, there was a cold snap, and then a warming in 9,700 BC. This is just a little diagram going from about 20,000 years ago up to the present. And what you had was very cold periods, so that's what people think of as ice age. It actually started to warm up a bit. Then there was a cold snap known as the Younger Dryas, if some of you have heard of that. Then this dramatic warming, which we now know based on Iceland green cores, sediment cores, etc., happened not over several years, not over a decade, as people used to think, or not over 100 years, as they thought when I was in graduate school, but literally happened within weeks, probably literally overnight, based on the best evidence. So really dramatic. And I don't want to belabor this here, but some people have suggested that there was a comet or meteor or some kind of physical impactor that ended the last ice age. Two comments. One, the dating for that is 10,900 BCE. That's been suggested, which is not the end of the last ice age. That's 12,900 years ago. The ice age ended 11,700 years ago, circa 9,700 BC. A lot of the dating is very iffy. I can tell you that as a geologist. But secondly, all the evidence that people have used to support a comet at that time can be, in my assessment, better explained by the sun, a major solar outburst, a solar event. And furthermore, there's other evidence, additional evidence, that supports the solar hypothesis that cannot be explained by a comet, So if it's not a comet, I already told you what I think it is. I believe it was the sun, and the sun is very active. Remember, the sun's always been important throughout, understandably, humanity's history. People have always, as far back as we can tell, thought of the sun as a deity, thought of it as God or one of the gods, etc. And something else that many ancient societies acknowledge is that the sun is sometimes quiet, but it's sometimes not quiet. Sometimes it can be very turbulent. The Egyptians talked about how the sun could be the life bringer, but also the destroyer. And they talked about that very explicitly. And I now am convinced they knew exactly what they were talking about. So One thing you want to keep in mind are what's known as plasma, or electrically charged particles with electromagnetic fields associated with them that hit the Earth all the time. The solar wind that's coming and hitting the Earth. This makes for pretty things in the sky at high latitudes under normal modern conditions, like the aurora borealis, or you have the equivalent in the southern latitudes. Here's a NASA. Of course, this is not to scale with the sun here and the Earth here, but you always have the solar energetic particles hitting the Earth, and that's fine if they're not too dramatic. But the sun can be explosive at times. It is a star, and it's like any other star in its class. It can go through periods of major outbursts, major sneezes, or as I was talking to someone yesterday, she used the analogy vomit, that the sun vomits on the Earth. Well, it's a crude analogy, but maybe explicit. The sun can undergo major solar outbursts, ejecting electrically charged particles, traveling at relativistic speeds. That means very good percentage of the speed of light. So hitting, impacting the Earth, impacting our magnetosphere, destroying the ozone layer, causing massive levels of radiation over short periods of time on the surface, dramatically changing the climate. This could literally melt glaciers and end an ice age. You can literally think of it in some cases like huge lightning bolts coming down and hitting the Earth in places, setting fires, causing all kinds of destruction. People don't want to think that this could be the case, but it is, and we have evidence for it. In fact, all the geological evidence now, ice core data, sediment core data, lunar data, indicates this happened 9,700 BCE. I'm convinced, looking at the data. And this is actually not super new. I just want to point out where people have talked about before, there was an astrophysicist, Thomas Gold, who talked about this back in the 1960s. He said, this is a partial quote from him, a big solar outburst, during a big solar outburst, the Earth's magnetic field could clearly not hold up the incoming gas. That's what we now call plasma or charged particles, and it would indeed drive down to the atmospheric level. It would take the form of a series of sparks burning for extended periods of time and carrying currents of hundreds of millions of amperes, causing, he said, massive destruction on the surface of the planet. He suggested looking for vitrification, basically melted rock. And we found that. He found it looking at the Apollo missions and the data that was brought back from the Apollo missions to the moon. He found just that type of evidence, as he said here, of a solar outburst in geologically recent times. Read that as 9700 BCE, end of the last ice age. And we find evidence of this on Earth, right in Egypt. This is from the Geological Museum in Cairo, a specimen of what's known as the Libyan desert glass. It's covers approximately 2,500 square kilometers, the strewn field of it. Traditional view of this from my geological colleagues is that it was a big comet that hit. But there's no evidence of the extraterrestrial comet or meteorite or that type of thing. There's no crater to go with it. But I believe it's explained cogently by a major solar outburst that was literally touching down in that region, melting the sand and forming what's known as the desert glass. It is a form of natural glass. We have another one here, the Gobekli glass in the western desert in Egypt. And this may not look like pretty glass, but that's what it is. It's natural glass where the surface of the rock has been melted and bubbled and recongealed. And studies have been done of this, and I won't belabor this now, but a guy named Michael Joseph, for instance, studied fulgurites. Fulgurites are where you know that in modern times a very strong bolt of lightning hit the ground, and you can look at what was formed while the rock was melted and then recongealed. And then when he studied these and looked at things like the Gobekli glass, he said, Well, you have all the same properties in these glasses, so we have to consider they're not comets or meteorites. They're from something like super lightning hitting, more or less a solar outburst. And even things like Schoch lamellae and crystals, or what they call shocked crystals and nanodiamonds, you can get that from a solar outburst or from lightning type features. I've looked at this myself in different places. So in Scotland, you get what are known as the vitrified forts, which have vitrification on them, and these have been dated back now to the end of the last ice age, some of them, even though they were being reused. And this is something we see around the ancient world, that structures were being used and reused and reused. So yes, they will find things here that are just 1,500 years old from the Dark Ages. And sure, people were living there, but they were re-inhabiting much earlier structures. And you find very good examples of vitrified glass. Here I'm holding some to show what it looks like. And you even have evidence of this right on the Giza Plateau. The Sphinx itself has a history going back to ancient dynastic times of having been hit by, quote, lightning. So we have, for instance, the inventory stela, and I like to take people to see this. This is the Temple of Isis. Most people don't see this in Egypt. And this is where this stela was found. And on it is an inscription. This is just outside, or just in the shadow of the Great Pyramid, right on the plateau. And there's an inscription there. And this is the great Egyptologist Salim Hassan from the middle of the last century. He talked about how this inscription says that the Sphinx was hit by a thunderbolt, and that Khufu, who supposedly built the Great Pyramid, went to see the Sphinx. Well, the Sphinx wasn't supposed to have been built when Khufu was around, because it was supposed to have been built after, or carved after the Great Pyramid. But this inscription says how he went to see the Sphinx, he went to see the damage by the thunderbolt, etc., and how the headdress was knocked off or damaged. And Salim Hassan says that, well, actually there is evidence on the Sphinx that it was hit by something. But he thinks it wasn't hit by lightning during Khufu's time. He thinks it was probably struck by lightning, but not when, he says there is not a particle of evidence to show that this accident happened in the reign of Khufu. I agree, it's not the reign of Khufu. Khufu was going to see something much more ancient, much more sacred, that they recognized that there had been this plasma strike thousands and thousands of years earlier. That may be why the Giza Plateau is sacred in the first place. It's where a god touched the earth. It's where the sun came down and literally manifested on earth. So I think it all gets really interesting and profound. This is me with one of the pieces of evidence of a plasma strike, vitrified rock right on the plateau. This is the second pyramid, and so we're at the base of the second pyramid, and there you can see some of it. It's really extensive. You don't get this from building little campfires or something on the rock. You can't get even close to the heat you need to do this, especially when you see that this penetrates down into the subsurface, and in some of the shafts you can see how it goes down numerous meters. There I am with it again. This just, if you know the Giza Plateau, this is, again, that's what's known as the mortuary temple. Just off to the right would be the second pyramid. And here we have a close-up of it. So there's a lot more evidence, though, and I want to bring in something else. Besides sediment cores and lunar data and vitrification, a really important component to this was brought to light by this man. This is Dr. Anthony Peratt, and he's a plasma physicist. He worked for many decades, and he's still associated with Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico. He's a plasma physicist who looks at very high energy plasma physics, and he found that when you look at petroglyphs or rock art, incredibly ancient rock art from the end of the last ice age, you find all the same diagnostic shapes, pictured on the rock art that you would see in the sky during a major solar outburst when plasma, these electrically charged particles at high intensity and high speed hit the magnetosphere, hit the atmosphere. Think of the aurora borealis, but on steroids, as people like to say. Also would come down to low latitudes, even to the equator. When you have a major solar outburst, it would surround the entire Earth. And he found that it would take on diagnostic shapes like stick figure man, which he's showing here in some of his diagrams. Again, think of the aurora borealis becoming much more distinct. These are some photographs in the modern day, but we don't have anything as distinct as it. You can start to see, this is known as a sprite, how it starts to form shapes like that. And these are some of the figures, and he found that there are a number of distinguishing features, 3 of which I want to point out. Stick figure men with dots on their sides. Well, real humans don't have dots on their sides, but if you're looking at plasma configurations, it's what's known as synchrotron radiation from swirling electromagnetic fields and the particles captured in them. So it's very good plasma physics that they're depicting. Stick figure men with so-called bird's heads, because some of the plasma takes on bird head shapes. Well, we see birdmen throughout the very ancient world, the depiction of birdmen. And then one more, cascading donut-like cylindrical shapes. And we see that depicted throughout the ancient world. So Dr. Anthony Perrott found these around the world. He and his team have found them in over 130 countries around the world. And consistently, he finds ones with these anomalies. If you think they just are primitive stick figure men, well, we don't have little dots floating on our sides. These are plasma shapes. He's convinced of it, and he can see the orientation, and they all orient to the same point in the sky from around the globe where the plasma was coming in. Here we have ones with the birds' heads on them, etc. So this is not evidence that would support a comet or a meteorite or an asteroid. It supports a solar outburst. That's what I was referring to in part when I was saying there's evidence supporting a solar outburst that can't be explained otherwise, to the best of our knowledge. Here's more from Dr. Perrott. I love this one in particular with the bird head, the stick figure with the bird head. And here's some that Katie and I and John Anthony West, he was still alive at the time, we did a conference in Norway, and I insisted I wanted to see some of the ancient petroglyphs from the end of the last ice age, same diagnostic shapes. Another place is Easter Island. Everyone knows Easter Island, I think, from the big moai, the heads and torsos. Well, they're wonderful, they're magnificent. But for our story, we have something else that's even more magnificent. And remember, Easter Island is this little island in the Pacific, isolated supposedly with the moai, but they also have birdmen. Remember the birdmen I was just referring to. And they have the birdmen, and I think these birdmen, these are nice stylized birdmen now, but they go back, I think, to the concept, to the earlier period of the end of the last ice age. These are traditions that were being passed down. And we also see at Easter Island the moai, but look, they are very similar in some respects with the hands towards the navel, that type of thing, as what we see in Turkey. Here's what's known as a female moai, and here's Urfa man, just for comparison. And what Easter Island is also very well known for in some circles, and I think one of the most fascinating things, is the so-called Rongo script, which is this hieroglyphic script which no one really understands or understood until I think now. And again, Katie keeps me on my toes. We were looking at things. We were looking at petroglyphs from Anthony Perrott and global plasma discharges, etc. And Katie says to me, don't these Rongo characters look like plasma discharge images? And the petroglyphs, I was stunned. I write about this in Forgotten Civilization. I was really stunned by it, and I am convinced she's right. And Dr. Anthony Perrott and his team are convinced she's right, because they said to us privately after we published this that they had discovered the same thing, but they hadn't published on it purposefully. But what you get are the same bird-headed men with stick figure shapes, and the stick figure shapes, and the same cascading cylindrical shapes, etc., in the Rongo Rongo. So what we suggest is, at least in the original form, this is essentially a scientific text of what's happening in the sky at that earlier period. Now, these are carved on wood. These do not go back 12,000 years. I'm not saying that whatsoever, but on the other hand, do we have Plato's original manuscripts, or Aristotle's, etc.? No, we only have copies of copies of copies of copies of copies, etc. That's what we have here. Doesn't mean the information doesn't go back to that earlier period. And just as a side note, everyone's heard of the Nazca geoglyphs. They seem to show this also, so it seems to be some common themes, and we see it, as I said, in Turkey. The Easter Islanders even had legends about how the Moai looked up to the sky, and they had legends about King Roko Roko Hitau, one of the legendary kings, how in his reign the sky fell. It fell onto the earth, and then the people cried out, "The sky has fallen in the days of King Roko Roko Hitau. He took hold, he waited a given time. The sky returned, it went away, and it stayed up there." Well, this is what you would see, I think it's being described poetically, but what you would see with a plasma solar outburst, that you'd have the sky, it would seem like it's falling. All this havoc is occurring, but then it goes away again when the sun calms down. So we have that happening. We have that at the end of the last ice age. This is a paper Perrott talked about, evidence for an intense solar outburst in prehistory. He didn't date it precisely. I'm dating it precisely based on further evidence in 9700 BC. So here you have what now I think is our new revised timeline of the Great Sphinx Gobekli Tepe, representing true civilization that was snuffed out by solar outbursts. We went into a dark age, which Katie and I have named Siddha, or the solar-induced dark age. That's a subtitle in the subtitle of my book now, because a second revised edition came out in 2021. The first edition was 2012, added another 150 pages, notes throughout, another 40 photographs. I'm not saying this to sell books, I'm saying this to make sure if you do want to get the book and look at all this data and more, get the new revised edition, or if you have the old edition, buy the new edition too. Because I'm very passionate that this is information people need to know. And it ties in, I think, with the concept of Plato and Atlantis, etc. This was referring to. But bringing it up to the modern time, the solar outburst describes what happened at the end of the last ice age with the melting of the glaciers. It actually would set off earthquakes. I talk about that in the new book and why, and that's correlated with solar activity. You would get huge flooding, not just from rising sea levels, but because you're melting all this ice and water, you put huge amounts of moisture into the atmosphere that comes out as incredible precipitation, causing flash floods. We know what that's like for parts of right now in America here. I mean, I just realized I'm in California because we flew in from Boston. So you know what that's like. Well, what caused the initial rains on the Great Sphinx? I think it goes back to that period. It would knock out the ozone layer, stratospheric ozone, cause high levels of radiation on the Earth, high enough that large mammals could die within a week or so. I've talked to a number of physicists about this. And it would incinerate things on Earth. In the modern world, it would just bring down all our technology. I mean, forget it. How do you survive this? The way you can survive it, and the way humanity, I believe, survived it in pockets was literally by going underground. So a good example of that is going underground, for instance, in Turkey. This is in Cappadocia. Some things could not go underground. So we have, at the end of the last ice age, and a number of papers have been written about this in the scientific literature, about huge synchronous extinction, in this case of North America's Pleistocene mammals. That's more or less the end of the last ice age, and how they all go extinct. This is uncalibrated, so that's why it says 10,000. This is basically 10,000 BCE at the end of the last ice age, because they couldn't escape. What could escape? Smaller animals that could go into nooks and crannies and go into little burrows and underground. Some things, like maybe some big cave bears, some of them could survive because they naturally lived in caves. So you get these massive extinctions. You also get evidence, and this is work that was done by the Austrian Heinrich and Ingrid Kusch. They explored all these caves and tunnels, narrow tunnels that, yes, date back 12,000 years to the end of the last ice age. They can't explain them. Why would people all of a sudden be spending all the time and energy to do this tunneling? Well, I think we know why now, because of the solar outburst. If it were a comet or a meteorite or an impactor, you wouldn't be doing this. It would just crush you. It would crush these caves down. But it would protect you beautifully from a solar outburst. You see this literally around the world. In Great Britain, you have all these barrows, as they call them. And Easter Island, you have artificial houses that were, yes, reused later for other things. All these structures were reused later. But I think their origin goes back to this period. In many places, including Easter Island, there's a tradition of living in caves and having, at times, to go into caves because of the havoc occurring on the surface. Here we're going into one. These are basically lava tubes that were then enhanced for utilization by humans. That's Katie in one of them. There I am coming out of them, and notice how they built up the entrances to protect them, so there's just the narrowest of entrance. Well, that's what you would do if you wanted to protect yourself from the radiation and the havoc that's occurring. Here, Mesa Verde, and this is Easter Island down in the bottom corner. Or we went to Malta, Katie and I was most interested in the caves there, which have the same tradition going back to the earliest period of habitation on the island. We see this example from Ajanta, India, where, yes, these were later recarved and used by, Buddhist monks or whatever, but the tradition and the origins, I think, goes back much, much earlier. And maybe the quintessential examples are in Cappadocia, in Turkey, not far from Urfa, not far from the region of Gobekli Tepe in Anatolia. This is when we take balloon rides over it. You can see it beautifully, how they carved into the rock to protect themselves. And they have the famous underground cities like Kamakoli, that you can go into, where you have 8 or more stories with perfect ventilation, incredibly sophisticated. Why would you do this? And I don't believe for a second it was to hide from the enemies, because the enemies would know exactly where it is, because you'd have huge piles of rubble on the surface. But you don't. Why? Because these things are so old, that's all eroded away now. 2,000, 3,000 years, it would not all erode away. As a geologist. But yes, they were reused later, so you find things in them from a later period. But I think they go back, the origins go back to this earlier period. Here's another one, Dariankuyu, where you can see the same thing. There I am. And it's just incredible, and incredible that they did this. They did it for a reason. Other evidence that population, this is one of the few places where a human population of substantial size could survive. Here's Gobekli Tepe, here's the Cappadocia, Anatolian region. And what's interesting, I always like, as a scientist, independent evidence, truly independent evidence. So independent evidence is things like linguistic studies. This case of the Indo-European language family, this was published in Science. I'm sorry, the bottom line got cut off, but it was published in Science in 2012. And what the authors concluded, looking at the language families, is that these families of languages all can be traced back to a common origin. If you can see the scale when it's calibrated here, they get traced back to a common origin that goes back to the end of the last ice age and is centered, lo and behold, on the Anatolian Cappadocia region. So that, I think, really is corroboration that a population could survive there because of the geology going underground and then emerge and spread once again. And two final questions I want to address. What happened after the demise of that advanced civilization? Well, it became a dark age. Just like we had a dark age in Europe after the Roman Empire fell, but this was much more extensive. So just to give you an example of this is 2,000 years younger than Gobekli Tepe. It should, according to traditional thinking, be more advanced. It's not. It's much more primitive. We don't have monumental stone sculptures. We don't have the sophistication that we see. And I'm not cherry picking. All the sites are like this. It's just basically crude mud, brick, and plaster. Not that level of sophistication you would expect if civilization had flourished and continued. No, it was thrown back. It was set back. And again, we refer to this as the solar-induced dark age. So bottom line is we have this civilization flourishing, we have solar outbursts, a solar-induced dark age, and this is not the beginning of civilization, 3,000 or 4,000 BC, but a re-emergence of civilization. The final thing I need to address in 2 minutes is, could it happen again? And answer is yes, we're probably overdue. Thomas Gold, who I mentioned to you before, he was an astrophysicist at Cornell, and he first talked about this in the 1960s as being a hypothetical possibility, and he thought hypothetically there should be a really devastating solar outburst every 10,000 years. Remember, the last one was, what, 12,000 years ago? 11,700 years ago? So by that, we are overdue. But that was just a crude, ballpark estimate. Studies since then, this was published in Nature, one of the premier science journals, indicate that they say 11,000 years. Let's just think in terms of the end of the last ice age. Since the end of the last ice age, the sun has been relatively stable until just modern times. And they have unusual activity of sun during recent decades compared to the previous 11,000 years. Another study published in Astronomy and Astrophysics indicates solar activity. So above this line is really unusual heavy solar activity. Below this blue line, unusual low solar activity. This is the end of the last ice age in here and just afterward. Notice how the sun was really active, but it also had huge mood swings if we think of it anthropomorphically. So it's really active, really erratic. This is when those early civilizations get knocked out, decimated. Then the sun slowly sort of stabilizes during the Siddha period, the solar-induced dark age. This is 4,000 BC. By 4,000 BC, it's been fairly stable for a while, and this is when civilization re-emerges and flourishes for the last 5,000 years. But notice, in the last 70 years or century or so, what's happening? The sun is becoming erratic again. It's becoming just as unstable, just as strong and powerful as it was when those early civilizations were wiped out. The problem is now, we don't know exactly what technology they had. I'm not going to speculate about that right this second, but we know what technology we have. Will it be destroyed by a solar outburst? Yes. Grid systems will come down, communication systems will come down, computers will be fried from what are known as solar particle events. I hate sounding like this.
Wow.
I know. I don't want to be a doomsayer. I'm not like that. I'm not trying to sell you prepping stuff or anything. I'm just telling you the real science. And we've had some close calls. We had a minor solar storm, something that was known as the Carrington event in 1859, which was huge from a human perspective, but minor from an astrophysical perspective, minor compared to what happened nearly 12,000 years ago. But if we had a Carrington event today instead of 1859, we would, yeah, exactly. We would not be talking right now. We wouldn't be here now because it would knock out our grid systems, it would knock out our computer systems, the internet. I mean, everything that modern technological society depends on would be knocked out. Who would survive? Those relic hunter and gatherer societies, you know, the quote primitive societies would be knocked, would probably survive if anyone survives. And we've had close calls in 1921, 1989, 2003, and they've had some effects. In 2012, we were almost hit by a CME that was not Earth directed, but unfortunately there are also what are known as micronovas, where the whole surface of the sun explodes, so all the planets, no matter where they are in their orbits, get hit. If that happens, there's no way we can avoid it, even by luck. So anyway, I don't want to be a doomsayer. I don't want to sound negative. I'm just warning you. So that's where we stand, and I think we really need to learn that civilization existed prior to the end of the last ice age. We need to learn that they're really a warning for us, and maybe they intended to send a warning to us, I don't know. But we need to learn from them. I think we need to learn from them fast. So as I wind up here in the last minute or two, I do want to say, if you'd like to see some of these sites firsthand, I've got a tour I'm leading. For the first time, I'm leading tours again after the COVID years. I haven't done a tour since 2019. I haven't done a tour to Turkey, I think, since 2016, maybe? Katie, does that sound right? Yeah, 2015? Yeah, 2015, it's that long. So we're doing a tour to Turkey in August, where you can see Cappadocia and Gobekli Tepe and these other sites. Many other sites. A tour to Egypt in May. If you'd like to join us, look at my website, www.robertschoch.com. Also, I want to say that I volunteer time and energy for different projects, including the not-for-profit Organization for the Research of Ancient Cultures, and I volunteer a lot of my time with them. It's a 501c3 or whatever it's called, not-for-profit. And something that we're doing is a movie about some of this material, which I think is so important, called Civilization Before Civilization. There you see Urfaman. There's a little trailer if you'd like to go to the website for Oracle, or it might be easier, just go to my website and you'll find a link to it. But if you'd like to get involved with that or donate or go on the mailing list, I encourage you. So I know I've more than run out of time, but I apologize for that, and I hope you found this of interest, and thank you very much.
Stay right there. Robert Schoch. Robert, stay right there. Robert, hang on, everybody. Hang on. You trust me, right? You trust me. We've been friends for a very long time. Katie, you trust me, right? Can I ask you one question I've never asked you? He's already nervous. What's it feel? Do you know? What's it feel like to have changed the world and to have this paradigm shift, looking back at ancient history and your placement in that? Do you feel that vibe? What? I just want to know. I mean, the presence of greatness.
Okay. Well, no, actually, I feel something. how do I want to say this? It's been a long, hard road, because when I first came out with this, and you know this well, in the 90s, I mean, I was so beaten down by my academic colleagues and so critiqued, and they tried to fire me and get rid of me, certain people, etc. I mentioned that. And I mean, that really is hard on one's psyche, and I almost walked away from it. And in part, John Anthony West convinced me not to walk away from it, because, you know, I had colleagues saying, why don't you just stick to your specialty, you know, be a traditional scientist, make a little bit of a contribution in an established field, just add on. You know, the classic things the classic thing in physics is for some physicists to, you know, have some constant that's known to so many decimal places, and their contribution is to extend it another 5 decimal places. That's very safe, and you're making a contribution. I took the hard road, some people would say, which is to really go beyond and take a big risk and gamble. If I'm wrong, I'm going to be, you know, forever wrong, but if I'm right, it's a whole different thing too. So hopefully I'm right. I think I'm right.
Robert Schoch, everybody, please. Just amazing. Thank you so much, Robert. Coming up next, right here, we got Billy Carson. Everybody stay right there. Billy Carson up next.